interested in primarily selling papers, getting viewers, and so on and so forth, and nothing seems to work better for that than reporting on terrorism. So it's a bit hard to see how that can really be dealt with in a way as to minimize the effectiveness of terrorism. Let me leave our discussion of terrorism at that and move on to a very closely related topic that I was hoping to cover in a very short time to get us onto international political economy. It seems like we're going to end up pushing that back until the next class. But that's international organized crime. And I just want to say a couple of very quick things about it. International organized crime is closely related to both to insurgencies and civil wars and to terrorism, and is an enormous problem and a rather tricky problem in international politics as a whole. The UN estimates that organized crime proceeds amount to somewhere around $1.5 trillion per year, of which about a third is the trade in drugs, 400 billion or so. The remainder is arms trading, human trafficking, piracy, and a whole slew of other activities involved in organized crime. Why is it an international problem rather than simply a law enforcement problem? Well, one reason is that, as these figures indicate, 1.5 trillion is well in excess of the gross national product of many states in the international system. And states like Guatemala, for example, have essentially, despite the fact that Guatemala is currently governed by a very conservative government, have thrown up their hands and said, we are powerless to deal with the problem of drug smuggling in our jurisdiction simply because we're outgunned and don't have the resources to confront these drug cartels that make much more than any of our, or have a larger budget than our law enforcement agencies and our military. Meaning, essentially, that drugs have undermined, to a considerable extent, states in the international system. It's an open question whether countries like Mexico, Colombia, or Afghanistan are states with a drug problem or drug problems with a state. Meaning that, to a greater or lesser extent, it is the drug cartels that control these states. In Mexico, there's extensive evidence that the biggest drug dealers in Mexico are not the Sinaloa cartels or the various other cartels, but in fact the Mexican military itself, which is actively involved in these cartels. The same thing is to a large extent true of Colombia. As much as Colombia blames the FARC guerrillas, the Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarios de Colombia, for the drug problem and accuses them of being drug terrorists, the Colombian state's own research, as well as and that's backed up by the research done by the Congress of the United States, estimates that the FARC controls roughly 3% of the drug revenues flowing through Colombia. The remainder is controlled by groups that are closely associated with the Colombian state, in particular the autonomous forces, the paramilitary organizations, very closely associated to the Colombian military. Afghanistan is a similar kind of a problem. Afghanistan today produces well over 90% of the opium produced on the planet, and thus the heroin. And it is estimated that that means that it is responsible for well over a fifth of the gross domestic product of Afghanistan. Depending on whose estimates you look at, it might even be higher than that. The problem that creates, especially in poor countries like Colombia, Mexico, Guatemala, Afghanistan, is that drug cartels have more money than the state does, and consequently create corruption, create tremendous opportunities for bribery of officials and things along those lines, and undermines the ability of states, therefore, to govern. It is such a threat to the social fabric. It is also a threat to the conventional economy. But more important than that, from an international perspective, is that the drug trade is very closely related to the trade in weapons. So in the relationship between Mexico and the United States, drugs flow north, money and guns flow south. Almost all of the illegal guns available on the market in Mexico come from the United States. And indeed, the United States is well aware of that and it initiated a program called Operation Fast and Furious, which was about well far ahead of the plots of the movies after which it was made, in which they encouraged gun dealers on the borders of Mexico to deliberately sell weapons to the drug cartels in Colombia, on the assumption that they would be able to track them and then figure out who they end up with. And when this surfaced and the Congress held an investigation, they got the Drug Enforcement Agency and the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms officials in and asked them, well, did you actually track them? And how did you track them? They said, oh, tracking is real probably. Insert a little tracking chip in the barrel or the stock of the weapon, and then we can track where it goes. And well, did you track it? Well, we did, except the problem was that the batteries only lasted 24 hours. Meaning that they couldn't track them, and the only way they could track them is that eventually they'd show up when they were used in a crime somewhere. Again, that tends to become rather problematic, as it should be obvious. The flip side of that is that as money flows south to Mexico and to Colombia and elsewhere, that money needs to be laundered. And there is considerable evidence that some of our largest banks internationally are, to a tremendous extent, responsible for that money laundering and have become, to a significant extent, dependent on money flowing in and out of those sources in order to keep them afloat. And that was most obviously noted when several banks were indicted for these kinds of things. The first to do so was the Bank of Credit and Commerce International in the late 1980s, a bank that was interestingly also extensively used by the CIA. And that was laundering money for a number of different organizations. But more recently, HSBC, the Hong Kong Singapore Banking Corporation, was fined several $1 billion for its extensive role in laundering money for the Colombian and Mexican drug cartels, as well as for groups affiliated with Al-Qaeda. They were fined several $1 billion, but none of them were held criminally, or none of their officials were held criminally responsible, which was interestingly explained as that the HSBC was simply too big to jail. So we've gone from too big to fail to too big to jail, which is rather problematic. Let me leave international organized crime at that, and at least get started for a minute or quarter to 8, so maybe that's kind of pointless. We will try to introduce international political economy at this point. I apologize for falling behind on the schedule, and hope that I can with all the stuff.